The night was unusually quiet when the woman found herself walking alone along an empty road, the streetlights flickering weakly above her. A chilling breeze brushed past her, carrying with it a sense of unease she couldn't explain. Then, from the shadows, a tall German shepherd stepped forward, his posture alert yet gentle. His amber eyes met hers, and for a moment she felt as though he had appeared for her, as if he already knew she needed protection. The dog stepped closer, never breaking eye contact, and the fear in her chest softened just enough for her to breathe. Before she could even process the moment, footsteps echoed behind her. A group of men emerged from the darkness, their intentions unclear but their approach threatening. The German shepherd immediately shifted, placing his body in front of her, rigid and ready. A deep growl rose from his chest, strong enough to make the intruders pause. The woman froze, trembling, unable to understand how a dog she had never met could act with such unquestionable loyalty. Yet he stood there as if he had been protecting her his entire life. One of the men stepped forward, but the shepherd advanced boldly, refusing to yield. The air grew thick with tension as the men hesitated, weighing the risk of confronting a fiercely protective dog. The shepherd's growl deepened, chest vibrating like a warning drum in the still night. The woman reached for the dog's fur, instinctively holding onto him, and the shepherd stood his ground as though her touch gave him even more strength. For a moment, danger hovered at the edge of the dim street. Finally, the men backed away, muttering curses as they disappeared into the darkness they came from. The shepherd didn't move until the last footstep faded, then slowly turned his head to look at the woman, checking if she was safe. She sank to her knees beside him, overwhelmed with relief, and gently placed her hand on his neck. The dog leaned into her touch with a silent understanding, breathing heavily but confidently, as if claiming her safety as his victory. They stood together for a long time in the middle of the empty road, the shadows around them slowly fading into quiet once more. In that moment, she understood that their paths were not meant to cross by accident. She whispered a soft, "Thank you," and the shepherd closed his eyes, absorbing the warmth of her voice. What began as a terrifying night had transformed into the beginning of a bond neither of them could have expected. Back at her small apartment, the woman opened the door and hesitated, unsure if the dog would even follow her inside. But the German shepherd walked in quietly, as though he already knew he belonged there. He sniffed the corners, studied the space, then settled near the couch, exhaling a long, tired breath. She watched him, noticing the fatigue in his body, not just physical, but emotional. There was a heaviness in the way he lay down, as though he had carried burdens far older than her fears. She brought him a bowl of water and, after a moment's hesitation, placed a blanket beside him. He lifted his head, sniffed the fabric, then gently laid his chin on it. She couldn't help but smile, there was something heartbreakingly gentle about him. When she sat beside him, the shepherd slowly shifted and rested his head against her knee. A warm pressure filled her chest at the unexpected trust he offered so quickly. She stroked his fur, sensing gratitude beneath every breath he took. Hours passed, and though sleep never fully came to either of them, they shared a stillness that felt safe. She couldn't stop thinking about how selflessly he had stepped between her and danger. The shepherd's ears twitched at every small noise outside, but he remained calm, as though he no longer feared for himself, only for her. That sense of purpose wrapped the room in a quiet courage that made her feel less alone than she had in years. Over the next days, the shepherd became a silent guardian of her home. He followed her movements, watched the windows at night, and responded instantly to any unfamiliar sound. She began to rely on him, not out of fear, but because his presence made her feel whole again. He filled the emptiness she had been too exhausted to confront. Sometimes she caught him staring at her with a longing she couldn't decipher, as if he wanted to tell her a story only he remembered. Little by little, she began to sense that the shepherd wasn't just lost, he was running from something. His nightmares, the way he jolted awake, the scars hidden beneath his fur, they all pointed to a past far more tragic than she had imagined. And so, she made herself a silent promise: she would protect him the way he had protected her, even if it meant uncovering the pain he had carried into her life. It happened on an ordinary morning. While brushing the shepherd's fur, her fingers brushed over something rough, a worn leather collar hidden under the thickness of his coat. She gently shifted it into view and found faded lettering burned into the leather. A name, a number, and a symbol she didn't recognize. Her heart tightened as she traced the markings, realizing this dog had once belonged to someone who cared for him deeply. The shepherd lowered his head, almost ashamed, as though afraid she would send him away after discovering his past. Instead, she knelt before him and held his face carefully between her hands. She promised him she wasn't letting go. The shepherd leaned into her palms, his eyes softening in a way that felt almost human. The mystery of his past pulled at her, and soon she found herself searching for the meaning behind the strange symbol. It didn't take long for her to learn it belonged to a rural training facility miles away, a place known for training dogs for rescue and protective service. The deeper she searched, the more she uncovered. Reports from years ago mentioned a devastating tragedy at that facility, a fire, a collapse, and a handler who had gone missing. Her chest tightened as she connected the details. The shepherd wasn't just trained, he was a survivor. A dog who had once risked everything for someone else, just as he had for her on that dark night. She wondered what horrors he had seen and how long he had wandered alone, grieving a partner he never stopped looking for. Determined to help him face his past, she loaded him into her car and began the long drive toward the remote facility. The shepherd seemed uneasy, shifting restlessly as if sensing where they were going. Halfway there, he placed his paw gently on her arm, leaning forward as though silently begging her not to return him to a memory that still hurt. She reassured him softly, promising no one would take him from her, she only wanted him to find peace. When they arrived, the ruins of the old training ground stood like ghosts in the fading sun. The shepherd stepped out of the car slowly, ears pulled back, tail low, his body shaking with a mixture of recognition and sorrow. She followed him quietly, her heart aching as the dog walked through the broken remains of his former life. She knew now that the road ahead would not simply reveal answers, it would reopen wounds, for both of them. Ever since they visited the ruins, the woman noticed subtle signs that something wasn't right. A car parked too long across the street. Footsteps outside her apartment in the middle of the night. The shepherd sensed it too, his instincts sharpened, his protective nature intensifying. He rarely slept, patrolling the apartment with a silent, focused tension. It was as if their discovery at the training grounds had awakened someone who didn't want the truth revealed. One evening, while the woman was preparing dinner, the shepherd suddenly growled and sprinted toward the window. A dark silhouette stood outside, watching. The moment the figure realized they'd been spotted, they walked away quickly, disappearing into the dark. The woman's heart pounded as she locked the door and pulled the curtains shut. Fear returned to her life, but this time she wasn't alone. The shepherd pressed against her leg, a steady reminder that he would not let harm reach her. Hoping to understand why they were being followed, she reached out to local authorities, who dug into the past of the training facility. What surfaced was unsettling: rumors of illegal operations, forced disappearances, and attempts to silence anyone who had witnessed them. The shepherd's handler, the young man who vanished in the tragedy, had apparently been investigating the truth. And now, it seemed, those responsible feared the dog still carried evidence they didn't want uncovered. The danger grew more real when, late one night, someone attempted to break into her apartment. Before she could shout, the shepherd hurled himself toward the door with a roar that shook the hallway. The intruder fled, but not before leaving behind footprints and a trace of urgency. She held the shepherd tightly afterward, trembling as the reality of the situation sank in. The danger was no longer a distant shadow, it was standing on her doorstep. She realized then that what bound her and the shepherd together was bigger than either of them. He had saved her once, but now she needed to protect him too. And together, they had to face the dark past that kept trying to return. No matter who stood against them, she would not let him fight alone. It was nearly dawn when the final confrontation arrived. The shepherd sensed it before she did, his ears perked, muscles tensed, breath quiet but sharp. A vehicle rolled to a stop outside her home, and multiple figures stepped out, moving with a purposeful silence that sent chills up her spine. She grabbed her phone, but the shepherd stepped in front of her, his posture fierce, his loyalty blazing like a shield. This was the moment everything had been leading toward. The intruders burst through the entrance, and chaos erupted instantly. The shepherd lunged forward, using his entire body to block the path to the woman. She could hear his growls echoing through the room, a raw and fearless declaration that he would not allow harm to reach her. Furniture toppled, Shadows clashed, and in the middle of it all, the shepherd fought with the heart of a survivor who had lost once and refused to lose again. She called for help, her voice shaking but determined as she watched him defend her with every ounce of strength he had. When sirens finally blared in the distance, the intruders scattered, attempting to escape. The shepherd, though wounded, stood tall between her and the broken door, panting heavily but refusing to step aside until the officers arrived. As the police took control of the situation, she knelt beside him, tears streaming down her face as she held his trembling body. He pressed his head gently into her chest, as if assuring her that he was still there, still fighting for her. In the days that followed, the truth was exposed. Those responsible for the facility's darkest secrets were arrested, and the name of the shepherd's fallen handler was cleared. The dog recovered slowly, surrounded by care, love, and the warmth of a new home. The woman stayed by him through every moment, whispering gratitude he could feel even if he couldn't understand the words. The past had finally loosened its hold on him. Months later, they stood together in a quiet park at sunrise, the world calm and full of promise. The shepherd's fur glowed in the early light as he leaned against her leg, content and unburdened. He was no longer a lost survivor nor a forgotten protector, he was her family. And she was his. Their story had begun with fear on a dark night, but it ended with hope, loyalty, and a bond strong enough to outlive every shadow they had ever faced.